This video is sponsored by Squarespace. Hello and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, hi, you are very welcome. This is Reading the Past and I'm Dr. Cat. Today, I want us to travel back to the late 13th century to take a look at the life of an English magnate turned King of Scots, turned French ally and ultimately English prisoner. His life and its key events were concurrent and intertwined with those that inspired the film Braveheart. Not that you would know it from the very limited screen time that his character gets in that particular film. And so, I think it's only fair that we make him the focus for today. But before we jump into today's topic, I want to say an absolutely massive thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring another video on this channel. When it comes to building, updating and managing my website, Squarespace has really made all the difference. Squarespace's Blueprint website design tool offers a massive variety of website templates, all of which are super easy to customise in every way. This is due to their Fluid Engine website design system. With this, it's simply a case of dragging and dropping. For even more convenience, you can edit your website on both your desktop and on your phone. I can also keep track of my website traffic using a whole bunch of useful analytics tools. Above all, this has been really helpful to keep an eye on my mailing list emails, to make sure they've all reached their intended destinations, but also to see if or indeed when they've been opened and what links in them are being clicked. So if you have signed up to receive emails from me but you haven't seen them yet, perhaps have a little check to make sure they haven't been caught up in your spam filter. To build, launch and manage your own website, go to squarespace.com for a free trial. And when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/readingthepast to save 10% off of your first purchase of a website or domain. Thanks again to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. But now, let's take a look at John Balliol, King of Scots. John Balliol was born between around 1248 and 1250. His parents were John. He was the founder and namesake of Balliol College, Oxford. Additionally, he was the Lord of Barnard Castle and Balliol in Vermeur in Picardy. His mother was the fabulously named Dervagilla, the Lady of Galloway. John was this couple's fourth son, and it's very possible that John was raised and educated in such a way as to best prepare him for a monastic career, with his elder brothers being expected to enter royal service, to act as politicians, diplomats, courtiers and or soldiers. However, by 1278, so when John would have been in his late 20s, his father and three elder brothers were dead, and thus John inherited the Balliol estates, which in England principally centred around Barnard Castle, County Durham and its surrounding areas. There would be, however, a delay of nearly a year before he actually succeeded to the full control of all of them. There were, it seems, issues to sort out. After all, much of the lands were being used as dowers for his mother and his sisters-in-law. John was also required to pay homage to both King Edward I and the Bishop of Durham for these lands. Between his elder brother Alexander's death in 1278 and John's assumption of control over his Balliol inheritance, the family lands in Northumberland were held in royal custody, as was John, if the contemporary chronicler Thomas Wicks is to be believed. It is, however, unclear quite why John would be in royal custody at this time. Wicks suggests there was a connection with John's hoped-for marriage to Isabella de Warenne. She was the second daughter of the Earl of Surrey, and the king's consent was apparently needed for this marriage to take place. But that, in and of itself, does not explain why John would have been in royal custody, so if it's true, I have to say it's a bit of a head-scratcher. Either way, presumably permission was granted, because John and Isabella would marry within a year or two of John coming into the full possession of his paternal inheritance. Their eldest child, Edward, would be born in around 1283. This couple, and indeed their entire families, were all connected to the English royal court, but John did also have ties, albeit more remote ones, to the Scottish throne as well. Because John's maternal great-grandfather was David, Earl of Huntingdon. David might have been named for his grandfather, who was David I, King of Scots. The younger David was also the brother of two other kings of Scots, Malcolm IV and William I. This lineage might have been nothing more than an interesting side note to the life of a medieval English magnate. That was, at least until first, the death of John's second cousin once removed. He was Alexander III, King of Scots, and he died on the 19th of March, 1286. Complicating matters was the fact that Alexander had been predeceased by his children. His wife was pregnant at the time of his death, but this pregnancy would not result in a live birth. Thus, Alexander's heir was his 3-year-old granddaughter Margaret, known to history as the Maid of Norway on account of the fact that she was the daughter of King Eric II of Norway and Alexander III's daughter Margaret. Nearly 4 years later, at the start of 1290, John Balliol's mother died, and he inherited a swathe of valuable lands in both England and Scotland, as well as the right to be called the Lord of Galloway. John was rich. Then, just a few months later, between the end of September and the beginning of October 1290, while the by then 7-year-old Margaret, Maid of Norway, was travelling to be crowned as Queen of Scots, prior to her then travelling for her planned marriage to Edward I's son and heir, Edward of Carnarvon, this little girl fell ill and died. Numerous aspiring claimants began to assert their right to the now vacant throne of Scots. 14 competitors presented themselves. Among this number was Margaret, Maid of Norway's father, Eric. He attempted to claim the throne of Scots on the basis of being the formally acknowledged Queen's father. King Edward I of England pointed to his own descent from Malcolm III of Scots as evidence for his own claim. Florence, Count of Holland, highlighted his descent from William I and Malcolm IV's sister, Ada. Descendants of the illegitimate children of William I threw their proverbial hats into the ring. There was another distant claimant who descended from Donald III, who is perhaps better known to fans of Shakespeare's Scottish play as Donalbain. Perhaps, though, the best claims rested in the descendants of David, Earl of Huntingdon. That would be in John Lord Hastings, Robert de Bruce, and John Balliol, respectively. It was widely considered that, of all of them, the best claims were those belonging to Robert de Bruce and John Balliol. Neither of these men seemed prepared to back down in favour of the other, and so war looked to be the likely conclusion. And this was something that the Scottish guardians and magnates wished to avoid. King Edward I of England was therefore approached, asked to intervene and to provide a ruling about whose claim should be recognised as being the superior one. Edward I was willing, on the condition that he would henceforth be recognised as the overlord of Scotland. I mean, after all, if his ruling was to hold any weight going forward, then his power to make that ruling should arguably be recognised. Unsurprisingly, the Guardians of Scotland did not view it this way and were reticent to agree to it. They pointed out that agreeing to such terms was a decision for a monarch alone to make, and thus it would be up to whoever Edward selected to provide their consent, or otherwise. The candidates were thus all duly approached for their provisional agreement, which they reportedly all provided. A court was convened to weigh the rival claims, which were presented to it in the approximately 5 months that followed. The ruling eventually came down on the 17th of November 1292. John Balliol was now King of Scots. He was enthroned at Scone at the end of the month on the 30th of November. Robert de Bruce, although he had lost out on the throne, still retained the bloodline and many of his camp of supporters, and so, to keep the peace, John was going to have to at least consider his rival's preferences. This may be viewed as an internal challenge to his royal authority. Nevertheless, as G.P. Stell asserts, quote, administratively, John's reign was distinguished. It saw a significant assertion of royal authority through Parliament, no less than 4 sessions of which were held between February 1293 and May 1294. In one unprecedented session, everyone with a complaint was summoned before king and council to show the injuries and trespass done to them by whatsoever ill-doers. Equally constructive was the ordinance of early 1293, creating 3 sheriffdoms in the West Highlands. King John had clearly grasped the crucial importance of establishing royal authority in the West and conducting government through royal agents at strategic regional centres, presaging later Stuart policy. I would argue that the thing that was inescapably damaging and disempowering for John was that requested, nay, demanded, overlordship of King Edward I of England. One of the effects of this was that anybody who found themselves unhappy with a ruling in a Scottish court could go to an English court and appeal the decision there. Indeed, in 1293, John went before the English Parliament to protest against this dilution of his power, of his nation's autonomy. The English government's response was not warm, and ultimately John seems to have felt compelled to back down, to submit, and to once more pay homage to Edward. I think at this point John realised that he was going to need backup if he was going to defy the English king, reclaim some control in Scotland, and if he wanted to have any hope of success in this. An opportunity came when King Edward I summoned his vassals to fight with him against the French in the summer of 1294. This summons was promptly ignored by John and 26 of his magnates. The following year, 1295, saw the opening of negotiations between France and Scotland. These negotiations would result in a treaty that would come to be known as the foundation of the famous Old Alliance. This agreement, this Old Alliance, would in fact serve to make England pretty nervous at various points over the coming centuries. There were plans to marry John's son and heir Edward to the niece of the French king. Tensions surrounding this would continue to simmer until the end of March 1296, at which point a war broke out between England and Scotland. English forces would claim a decisive victory within a month. This happened at Dunbar on the 27th of April. And these victorious forces were led by John's former father-in-law, John de Warenne, Earl of Surrey. And I say former father-in-law because John's wife Isabella was, we believe by this point, dead. Indeed, it's believed that she passed away at some point before John became King of Scots. After Dunbar, John retreated north. Edward I reached Perth by the June, because it was at Perth that Edward received John's representatives, who were seeking to make peace with him. The Bishop of Durham, who was invested with the authority to ensure that King Edward I's interests were best served, drove a hard bargain. It was one that John would capitulate to. John's repentance was a requirement, as seemingly was his public humiliation, and so he was made to confess his rebellion, renounce the treaty with France, and abdicate the throne. All of this was completed by the 10th of July, 1296. It is possible that he was displayed, even paraded before his people, in clothing that had been visibly stripped of the royal heraldry of the King of Scots. John's nickname, Tomb Tabard, meaning empty surcoat, was, it is believed, born out of this demotion. Edward I ordered that the Stone of Destiny, also known as the Stone of Scone, which was part of the crowning seat for Scottish monarchs, should be removed to Westminster Abbey, and that it should there be placed beneath a seat for English monarchs to be crowned upon thenceforth. John was then escorted out of Scotland into England. From the start of August 1296, he was imprisoned in the Tower of London. John might have been a disgraced king forced to abdicate and now a prisoner, but that certainly did not mean that he was kept in either meagre or uncomfortable conditions. Quite the opposite, in fact. He was lodged in fine rooms, well fed, surrounded by a large retinue of personal household servants. He also kept at least a couple of horses, 2 greyhounds, and some 10 scent hounds. You may be wondering what good all of these beasts were to an inmate, particularly to an inmate of the Tower. Well, John did not remain at the Tower of London for his whole imprisonment. There was, for example, a period of more relaxed house arrest at Hertford. John was allowed hunting privileges, in which pursuit he would have put those animals to good use. In June 1299, a truce was brokered between England and France. One of the terms of this truce was the release of John Balliol. But if John had hopes that this meant his return to Scotland, even to the throne, he would be bitterly disappointed. Edward I had consented to the Pope's demand for John to be transferred into his custody, and so John and his escort landed on the French coast on the 18th of July. Before long, in around October 1301, news reached England that John, rather than being in papal custody as agreed, was instead ensconced at his family seat in Picardy. It was said that he enjoyed the support of the French king, who was holding out hope of returning John to the Scottish throne. Certainly, John continued to be viewed as rightful King of Scots by many of the leaders he had been compelled to leave behind in Scotland. They might have been dissatisfied by John's compromised status in regards to England and English authority, but he was, for many, still their king. And those leaders were busy rising up against English control of Scotland, with William Wallace being arguably the most famous of these. Even Edward I recognised that John's return to Scotland was a very real possibility, one that he may even have been willing to countenance. However, he would seemingly not have been willing to recognise John as king if this return should happen. In any case, these hoped-for moves would not materialise. John Balliol would never see Scotland or indeed England again. He died in Picardy at the start of 1315. By which point he would have been in his mid-60s. John's eldest son Edward then swore fealty to the French king. This allowed him to take possession of his Balliol inheritance in Picardy. Edward would survive until 1364, when he would have been around 81. He did, however, have no children, and thus the direct Balliol line died with him. As for the title of King of Scots, the grandson of Robert de Bruce, who had been John's principal rival for the Scottish throne after the events of 1290, was ultimately enthroned as Robert I at Scone in 1306. So what do you think of John Balliol, of his rise and fall, of his kingship, of its brevity, of the challenges he faced within it, of his imprisonment and his exile? As always, I'm looking forward to reading your conversations in the comments section underneath this video. I would also love it if you could pop an emoji or a social glyph in the comments too, because that will boost the engagement, and the more engagement a video gets, the more YouTube say they share it out, and that should help us to grow our community. As we've been talking about magnates, castles, kings and battles, perhaps an emoji that fits that, whichever you think best. I'm looking forward to seeing what you pick. You can also find me elsewhere on social media. I will leave links to all the other places you can find me on the internet in my description box. Please do follow me over on some or all of those so we can continue this conversation and start some others. I do hope that you enjoyed this video and found it useful. If you did, please do share it with your friends. And in fact, if you like the channel, let some pals know about it. You can tell me you like this video in particular by hitting the thumbs up. Please do subscribe to the channel, and if you think you are subscribed, now is the time to have a check to make sure that YouTube has not mysteriously unsubscribed you against your will. And while you are there, checking, subscribing, maybe resubscribing, please do hit the bell icon that sits beside the subscribe button and then select all in the drop down that will appear, and that way YouTube claim that they will tell you when I've next uploaded, but also when I'm next planning to go live, which I do to talk about the history news, and I know you're not going to want to miss that. We have, of course, now got our failsafe. I've got a website which I will leave linked. It's www.katrinamarchant.com. When you're there, go to the contact page. On the contact page, you'll find a little box. Put your email address in that box and press submit. That will allow me to send you a message once a week to let you know what I've been up to, and also to send you useful links for my content for the coming days. I hope you're going to have a great day whatever you're doing, and I look forward to speaking to you all in my next video. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye for now.